You've watched probably what we put together for the first segment for the dissertation. We've talked about chapters 1, 2, and 3. Dr. Eric Stennett, the director of our program, Dr. Kim Abel, who also graduated from this program. She was a part of cohort 2. As you recall from part 1 that we did for the dissertation video, it involved Dr. Abel as Assistant Vice President of Human Resources at Carnegie Mellon University. But I also had the privilege of having her in class, and she was one of the delights that I had in class. So it's good to know that she's also done a quality dissertation. Dr. Stennett, let's talk about chapters 4 and 5 and what goes into a quality dissertation.
I think what we need to keep in mind is this program specifically, one of our assessment strategies for the entire program is we want to ensure that our dissertations are high quality. Now, any program that has a doctoral program, there is always going to be a range of dissertations, you know, in terms of awards or in terms of quality, but we have a standard of dissertation that must be met in order to complete the program. So your chair is going to be, there, we train our chairs here in this program, and our chairs know what quality dissertations look like, and we do train them on ensuring that happens. So the student doesn't need to worry about that, but they need to understand that they really will not successfully complete their dissertation and successfully defend until we know that that dissertation is quality, and there are checks and balances along the way to make sure that happens.
Tie the connection between chapters 1, 2, and 3 and
Sure.
what people will do in chapter 4.
Well, the best tie, when you start chapter 4, the first thing you're going to do is an overview that will articulate the research questions. You're going to bring the research questions back in, you're going to talk about them again, and then you're going to start moving into the timeline of what you actually did for the dissertation. Now, it's not going to be a step-by-step recipe, but it is about how you collect data and the time frame it took to do that. So those two pieces start to connect 1 to 3 to 4. Also in 4, you're going to start to present data in a logical sequence. Certainly there's going to be tables, there's going to be figures. You need to have narratives that describe that data. The key to chapter 4 is you are not analyzing it, you're simply putting down the data that you collected. It's just about showing the data that came out in your study, not the actual implications of that data. That's for chapter 5.
What was your approach, Dr. Abel?
Well, as Dr. Stennett's talking, I think it's so important to anchor chapter 4 to your research questions and to chapter 3, because that really is the framework and is how you completed your study, and chapter 4 really is the documentation of that process. I think that it is really challenging because you become so familiar with your study that when you are presenting the data and the information in chapter 4, you understand it, but other people don't. And if I can tell the story, I would come in and go, "Look, Dr. Stennett, this is what I found." And he's like, "I don't know what this means." And then I would discuss it with him, and he would go, "Wow, that's really interesting, but we got to present it in a different way," right? So we had to like fine tune that process, because it really is easy to get caught up in the fact that you are very knowledgeable on your topic, but that it's going to matter to someone. It matters to you because you're writing it. It matters to your chair and your committee because they are supporting you and all the faculty that have invested in you. But it's going to matter to someone who reads it, and you want to make sure that you optimize that chance for them.
Chapter 5 of the dissertation. What's involved in that chapter?
Well, I'm going to tell you anecdotally that most doctoral candidates tell me that it's the hardest chapter to write for several reasons. First of all, that is the so what. What does it mean now? All this data you collected, the whole entire study comes to fruition with your ideas of, here's what I found, and here's maybe why it happened. And then the other piece I think students get a little disappointed about is you have to go back out and collect a little more research to explain your findings, because there's other researchers out there that may have similar findings. So you have to go out and either support your findings or refute them with research. So it's a pretty critical chapter. It's really one of the hardest to write because you're really trying to think through what you just found out. I would say the other piece, chapter 5, that's critical as well is, and anybody who does a dissertation will tell you this, at the end of it you're going to have a section on future implications, but also further ideas for future research. And a lot of people who go into dissertations will go there right away to see what they may want to add to their research based on your study. So those things are pretty critical, but it is a difficult chapter to write.
The gaps that people began to assume when they started the dissertation process, that somehow they had these moments of epiphany as they began to plunge into the literature. Those gaps also emerge because as they're going through the study, they realize they can't cover all of these areas, and that chapter 3 helps them to pigeonhole based upon the questions in chapter 1. How did you approach chapter 5?
So I think that as I'm listening to you all and reflecting back on my experience, one of the strategies that I used throughout my study and throughout my research, I took memos, analytic memos, and that was a time where I would step back and I had those aha moments. Well, I may have had an aha moment in chapter 1 that actually helped me write chapter 5. And because I had documented that and I had that process and I used that tool, it allowed me to make those connections. And I did that throughout the process. So for me, chapter 5, it was exciting, but it also was important that I narrowed down. And you can, like, literally get caught up in wanting to, fix the world. And you can't do that. You really do have to be grounded in your research questions and grounded in answering the gaps, as you said, identifying the gaps, but then also recognizing more gaps. So my study was the first type and kind of this approach to even studying the material. And so I had to early on recognize that I wasn't going to answer anything. In fact, at the end of my dissertation, I was going to be asking more questions because the information that I was synthesizing was creating and fine-tuning those questions that exist in that area of content.
Two things, Dr. Abel, I want you to address for our students. And they are not things that can be necessarily gleaned from somebody else's writing. How did you get to the point that you were this focused when you were working on your dissertation? And the second thing is the amount of dedication that you had to put to this process.
So when you asked me these questions in preparation for today's conversation, I jotted down some words, and so I'm going to actually look at them. But in regards to my own personal perspective, I had to have discipline, commitment, and I had to compromise. So I had to create discipline within my schedule, discipline in the way that I approached my studies and my coursework, even how I read articles and reflected on them. I really had to create, just like an athlete has to have discipline, as a scholar, I had to achieve that discipline. The commitment is not only to your colleagues and the faculty members and to yourself, but also to the work that you're doing and the importance of that work. And then in regards to compromise, there were times where I didn't get to do a family vacation, or I didn't, I had to make choices, but because I was able to see the big picture, that was important. And then in regards to a student, as a student, I came in with very low confidence in my writing. And I learned through this process that I am a writer. But that required me to take risks. And so I think for me, it's about risk taking, it's about patience, and it's about process. And so I had to be willing to step out of my comfort zone and get into that courage zone. I had to think about being patient with myself and recognizing that I was going to make mistakes and that I was going to stumble. And then also the value of literally, and I remember someone early on, Dr. Sobelhart, talked about the thinking chair. And I reflected on that a lot because there were a lot of times where I would just sit and think. And you learn how to think as well, and that's a really important component. But that process of bringing all the information together, revising and rethinking, and having those conversations with your chair and your faculty members to expose ideas that you have and test those ideas is really valuable.
Dr. Stinnett, you've seen a number of people finish the dissertation. What did you see on their faces when they finally realized they had come to this culminating point of completion?
Well, I think that right before that, when they defend their dissertation, it's a pretty nerve-wracking time. I mean, I can't sugarcoat that.
No.
And, you know, but the most interesting piece of that, and I think what you really need to understand, is you become the expert. You become the expert on that topic, even more so than the three people sitting there that you're defending your dissertation, your chair and your committee. While I will say you typically will become very close to your chair and your committee, it is a defense, and they will make you defend. It's not just a PowerPoint presentation. You have to defend, and we're going to ask you tough questions because you're the expert. And when you leave this university, you know, Kim's the expert in that area. And, you know, when people call on her as the expert, especially her topic, she really has to know what she's talking about, or she's, you know, it's not going to look good. So that's what the defense does. It's testing you to see if you're the expert. We ask the same question every defense. I don't hide it. I'm going to ask you to tell me in 2 minutes what your dissertation is about and what do I need to know that you discovered. You have 2 minutes, and they do that. I think another question we ask too, and I do this purposely, is I ask them something they did not research or something similar but they really didn't cover. And the expectation is an expert's going to say, that's not something I covered. That's something I would have to look further into. You got to stay in your lane. But I have to tell you, the emotional significance of finishing that dissertation is overwhelming. I haven't seen a dry eye yet.
We want you to know that this is all doable. All three of us have gone through this process. I remember my mother when she went through the process before me at the University of Pittsburgh years ago. And she talked about becoming almost, as it were, a card-carrying member, that the expectation that nobody's just going to hand this to you when you are defending your dissertation. But your committee, especially your chair, and now that we have cohort coordinators, we're walking with you, even if we're not your chair or on your committee, to encourage you along the way to make sure this process works. And we just want you to watch the forms that are available to you because somebody else has gone before you. You can complete this task, and you can do a quality dissertation.